Rania, before we close here, I want to note this is the 75th anniversary of NATO, of course, and Biden, from the current time we are speaking, about 2 hours from the current time we are doing this recording, will be giving a press conference, which is people are saying this will show if he's good or if he's not. But outside of that, I think it is, it's a big anniversary. It's a round anniversary. I mean, there's so much that could be said about NATO, but, I just want to say a couple things, and then get your thoughts. I think the lack of any real discussion around what NATO really is in America is a huge crime. It's a war alliance. It's designed to push U.S. unipolar hegemony around the whole world, to isolate countries that the U.S. does not like, to capture the leadership of Europe to make sure that they can't push their own affairs. They're now extending into Asia. They've pushed the issue in Afghanistan and Libya that have destroyed countries around the world. So it's totally fake, but it's important for people, I think, to understand elements of the history. Because when you hear about NATO, they say it's a defensive alliance formed in the first Cold War. Now, of course, the Soviet Union's been gone for some time, so not a lot of people to push back. But I want our viewers to understand it is not, in fact, a defensive alliance. It was not started for defense. It was started for offense against the Soviet Union because there was never a threat of war. There was never a threat of the Soviet Union invading Western Europe. That was never real, and that's documented. And I want to read you some things because I want to make sure that people understand that history correctly. 1946. Now remember, NATO was founded in 1949. 1946, Secretary of Defense James Forstall, Secretary of Defense, said in his diary that the Soviets would not move towards war at any time. Secretary of Defense, 1946. He also noted shortly after that the U.S. military government of Germany, so the guy who was dealing with the Russians every single day right after World War II when the Allied powers had divided it, said that the Russians did not want war. And just to keep going here, Rania, because we're on a roll, 1946, remember NATO, 1949, General Dwight D. Eisenhower told Forstall, the Secretary of Defense, the Russians would not take, this is a quote, the Russians would not take steps leading to immediate war. And in fact, one of his top generals would say in 1948 that he was confident the Russians didn't want war. And as late as 1952, after NATO had already been formed, Eisenhower's chief of staff at the time told the press publicly, in my mind, there isn't going to be any war. Even George Kennan, the architect of U.S. Cold War policy, said in 1950, a year after the formation of NATO, and he said this to Reader's Digest, a conservative anti-communist publication, that it was, quote, hardly likely that the Soviets were, quote, charting a course for an early military onslaught on the Western world. So there was never a threat of a Soviet invasion of Western Union. There was always an attempt by the United States to try to make sure that the governments of Western Europe did not become what you might call politically pluralist. Because what was happening is that you had the resistance to the Nazis that had existed during World War II, which was very broad politically, from communists, on the left, to people like de Gaulle, very conservative people on the right in France. And coming out of the war, the communists especially, also other left-wing forces, had a lot of support in the population in countries like Italy, countries like France, places like Yugoslavia, places like Greece, and the people there wanted to have governments that they wanted to elect democratically that would probably have all these political forces in hand. And some of them, like Italy, the communists probably would have won. That's why the United States in 1947 started undermining Greece, because they knew the same thing would happen. And they needed to create an alliance that would sort of freeze things, so they manipulated the policies. And I want to read you one more quote that's important here, because an issue that heavily led to this, if you get into the things about NATO and you're reading about this, they'll say, well, what about what happened in Germany and the Soviets trying to divide Germany? Well, the Soviets, Stalin, there's many things we could say about Stalin. He wanted to unify Germany. And the U.S. did not want to unify Germany. And it's on the record. One of the key policymakers of the United States said in their discussions about Germany, the difficulty under which we labor, this is a quote, the difficulty under which we labor is that in spite of our announced position, we really do not intend to accept German reunification. So from the very beginning, the idea of NATO, of a U.S.-anchored military alliance that went along with the Marshall Project and the early formations of what would become the European Community and then the European Union, was designed to make sure that there was a buffer zone in Western Europe where even if the people themselves wanted to vote it in, even if the people were for it, even if they were going to cast their ballots democratically, just like George Washington talked about, at the Battle of whatever, that they would not allow that they would form a whole separate set of governments, that they would form military alliances and political alliances to shut out the communists and to shut out anyone else in society who said, why don't we try to work together? And we had World War I, we had World War II. Why don't we build what they used to call a common European home where we can all live together from the UK to the Urals, and we can have some form of modus vivendi. All our governments won't be the same. All our ideology won't be the same, but we can reunify Germany. We can reunify our continent in a way that can prevent another world war. But the U.S. said no, because they wanted to be the preeminent power. As they were talking about, they wanted it to be the American century. They were openly saying that, all of them, the top U.S. Business people, politicians, that they wanted to dismantle the old colonial world. They wanted to get rid of the British and the French Empire, and they wanted to take over. And they wanted to dominate the old colonial powers. They wanted to dominate the global South so that they could increase their profits, increase their corporations, and increase everything. But the Soviet Union was an obstacle to that because A, many countries wanted to be communist countries and socialist countries, and B, there were countries who wanted to have good relations with them, even if they didn't want to be communist or socialist countries, and they operated as a roadblock to the United States being able to have this massive control over the world, the so-called American century in the post-World War II era. So they created a fake threat. They created a fake threat of an invasion from the Soviet Union. They manipulated the politics of German reunification in order to really sort of draw the Soviets into a more aggressive posture so that they could then go on from that and set up these military alliances that would allow them to capture Europe. As you can see today, why do all the European leaders just cut their own throats of their economy and destroy their economy for the war in Ukraine? Because the U.S. has spent every waking moment from 1943, quite frankly, up until today, creating a totally neutered, captured, mentally enslaved leadership through entities like NATO in order to make sure that they maintain control of the world. That's why they put it in the first national defense strategy after the end of the Cold War, that one of the key factors was to keep control of Western Europe. That's how Mr. Wolfowitz wrote it in the original document, because they understood that any other power center that says maybe the U.S. shouldn't be able to unilaterally decide what every other country does at every other time and force its own companies and its own interests onto everyone, no matter what the costs are, that kind of power or government anywhere else in the world is dangerous. That's why they're trying to encircle China. That's why they're moving NATO towards China. A lot of it was accusing China of helping Russia in the war in Ukraine. You've got Prime Minister Kishida in Japan saying he wants to bring NATO alliances more into Asia. This is what it's all about. It's all about control. It's not about defense. It never has been. The history has been manipulated. It's honestly unbelievable how clear the information is, how readily available it is, and yet it never enters into the mainstream media. So I'm sorry that's a little bit of a rant, Rania, but I think it's very important for people to understand the construction of NATO, which goes along with the construction of the national security state, the establishment of the Pentagon, National Security Council, the CIA, and others, is all part of one drive that also went with the Taft-Hartley anti-union law, that also went with the role of the Marshall Plan. It was all one drive to turn the 20th century into the American century, which means the century of the American capitalist and imperialist. And now they want the 21st century to continue to be the American century, the century of the American capitalist and imperialist. And they're afraid that it looks like it could be the Asian century, maybe the Asian African century, and they're doing everything they possibly can to stop it. And NATO is their wedge. NATO is their vehicle. It's a war alliance. It's not a defensive alliance. It's an imperial alliance, and it's designed to help them control the world.
Oh, I think that's all necessary to break down. That was a very fantastic explanation of what NATO is and what it continues to stand for. And it really is incredible, because it's like we live in some upside down world where if you are reading the New York Times or watching CNN all the time, and then you're watching what Eugene just broke down, you would be like, wait, this sounds like two completely different entities. Because NATO is promoted as this like freedom, this organization that is trying to just guarantee freedom and save Europe and America and the civilized world against the Russian and Chinese barbarians. And I do think it's important to recognize the way NATO is still being used, because that history is important to understand that, like you said, same reasons for its existence today, to try to crush any power that seeks to forge a path independent, not even antagonistic to, just independent of U.S. interests. And that's why, of course, China needs to be attacked. That's why you see an encirclement of China, and that's why you see an attempt, and there goes my electricity, but that's why you see an attempt. That's why you see an attempt to turn NATO into an anti-China alliance as well.